Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Jakarta EE9 Impact. I'm Ryan CUPRAK. Before I dive into the presentation, a little background on myself. I'm president of the Jakarta EE Ambassadors. I've written one book on Enterprise Java, two books, one on Enterprise Java Beans and the other one on NetBeans. I run the Connecticut Java Users Group, and I'm a software at Dassault Systems for a number of years now, working on formulation software. I've been involved in Jakarta EE for Java EE going back probably 15 years now. So it's been quite a while. I've done quite a bit with it. Just a little plug for the software that I work on. If you're curious about my background or what I work on chemical formulation software, which does use Jakarta EE, Java EE. You can check out the video there. I work on formulation software, so it's used to design all of your toothpaste and shampoos that you use on a daily basis. So it's kind of interesting stuff. So with that, I'm going to dive into what is Jakarta EE. So if you aren't familiar with it, or you're kind of, you've heard of Java EE, Jakarta EE, Jakarta EE slash Java, Jakarta EE, which was formerly Java EE, is a community and open source, open vendor driven open standard. It was originally named Java EE or J2E back in the day, a long time ago, probably around 20 years ago. Several years ago, it transitioned from Oracle to the Eclipse Foundation in 2018. Which is actually a great thing because it's no longer driven by a single vendor. So after the acquisition, after Oracle acquired Sun, Oracle kind of had a lot of control over it, and um, did a great thing, which was donate it to the Eclipse Foundation so that it could evolve in the open. It is composed of numerous specifications, including JMS messaging, web services, security specifications, servlets, WebSockets, JSP pages, JPA for object relational mapping. So it's a huge set of specifications that cover many different aspects of enterprise development. There are multiple open source and commercial implementations to choose from that have been around for a number of years right now. And there's even new ones that are coming out or have come out within the last couple of years. Um, Specifications include test compatibility kits verifying conformance to the standards, so that if you move between different implementations, you have confidence knowing that your code, if it ran on one implementation, will run on another implementation. So all implementations must pass a TCK in order to claim adherence to the standards. Um, so Jakarta EE or Java EE was first released back in 1999, so it's been around for about 23 years now. As I mentioned, applications are portable between implementations. It has throughout its history been backward compatible, which means that an application written in 2001 you can still compile and run today. Which you can't say that of many technologies that are out there, because most things, after a couple of years, if you don't upgrade, it's near impossible. Um, you might Many software developers in the Java ecosystems don't realize that they're actually Java EE developers. So there's kind of a misconception that you have to be writing applications that deploy to a traditional application container like WebSphere, WebLogic, or Glassfish. That's not necessarily the case. So, if you are working with JPA, using Hibernate or Eclipse Link for doing persistence, you're using EE technologies. If you're writing JSPs or servlets, or writing RESTful web services, or doing messaging, these are all built on top of all of the code that you're writing is built on top of Jakarta EE, Java EE APIs. So even if you're not the traditional, working with a large application container, you're still probably using one of the Jakarta EE, Java EE technologies. So it's had a huge impact on the Java ecosystem, and probably well over, at least I think the survey that was done a couple of years ago, well over 85% of Java developers are using some sort of Java EE, Jakarta EE technology in their application stack. It's evolved throughout the years, so every iteration has come with new releases. Um, with back in we had enterprise Java beans introduced back in JEE J2E back in 1.2 back in 1999, and it's kind of continued to evolve. The real big jump was around Java EE, where annotations were added in and things were simplified with the addition of CDI in Java EE6, and it continued to evolve through EE7. EE8 added support for HTTP2 security and started pruning old APIs that were no longer needed. They're no longer used. And then after Java EE8, it transitioned over to the Eclipse Foundation and was really re-released. Java EE8 was re-released as Jakarta EE8. Same exact thing, just with the new name, Jakarta EE. And then the really big transition, which is impacting um, the Java EE, Jakarta EE development space, was the namespace transition with Jakarta EE9, and that's the subject of the presentation today. And so that transition is actually in progress. It has been, implementations have been released and development has started on Jakarta EE10, which will be introducing new features that will be coming out this year. So it's really been a steady trend, a steady progression of releases throughout the years. With the donation and transition to the Eclipse Foundation, releases will most likely be coming out at a faster clip than they were in the past. The Jakarta EE ecosystem is, this cannot be stressed. I mean, it's a huge collection of tools and application containers, et cetera, that are built upon Jakarta EE. So we have everything from WebLogic to Weld to Prime Faces. All of these are built and provide services to Java EE, Jakarta EE applications. The Jakarta EE specifications, as I alluded to in the intro slide, Jakarta EE is composed of a number of specifications, and you can use implementations of these independently. So if you have a simple command line application, you can use, for example, the JSON APIs for processing JSON. If you're writing, a smaller web application, you can use CDIs and CDI servlets and JAX-RS to implement web services. So it's a huge collection of technologies. It's hard to know them all. It's such a large breadth of different technologies. Um, so it's a huge collection of them, um, and there's interesting stuff in each one of them. So I've used many of them over the years for different things. Um, but it's a huge collection, and that goes back to the comment that a lot of developers out there don't realize that they're actually dependent upon um, Jakarta EE, Java EE. So just to stress that. So if you're writing servlets, you're using a Jakarta EE technology. If you're writing a RESTful web service, you're using something from Jakarta EE. And so it's very pervasive throughout the Java ecosystem, and especially if you're doing any type of server-side development. So the Java EE transition to Jakarta EE. Java EE transitioned from the JCP to the Eclipse Foundation back in 2018 and was given the name Jakarta EE, which was donated by Apache. It has an open governance, open source, open compatibility testing. So previously, the compatibility test kit was the vendors had to pay in order to access it. It has now been open sourced so that you can actually see the results. You can see the tests. You can participate in helping improve those tests. So if you run into a difference in behavior between two containers, you can actually take a look at the tests, see whether they cover it. So it's fully open, whereas before parts of it were closed. It's got a well-defined specification process, a clear flow for IP, so that the IP has correct ownership, so you don't have to worry about a patent troll, etc. It is vendor neutral and has a level playing field between the different vendors. The key stakeholders that have been involved in Java EE before its transition have continued to be involved after the transition to the Eclipse Foundation. So Oracle is still very much involved, as well as IBM, Red Hat, Pyera, VMware, and there's been some new companies that have gotten involved as well. So it's just not the same companies that were involved before. It's actually continued. It's actually growing and is continuing to thrive. And community participation is a key attribute of it. If you're interested, I know this talk in about 30 minutes. There's a Jakarta EE weekly call, status update on what's going on with Jakarta EE10. Anyone can join the call and listen in or participate in and hear what's going on with the Jakarta EE10 release. So it really is open participation. You can jump in, you can see what's going on. It's not like the Apple conference or the Apple announcements that will be going on later today, where we'll find out what Apple's been working on in secret and what the impact is going to be upon on software development. So um, the Jakarta EE Java EE is an open standard. It is community driven. There are no surprises. You can see where it's going. Um, and it's moving on quite nicely, and you can definitely get involved. So the Jakarta EE9 transition to the Eclipse Foundation, while it's great that it was donated, the one thing that was not donated was the namespace. So JavaX was not included in the donation to Eclipse. So what has to happen, and this is where the Jakarta EE9 release comes in, all of the Java packages have to change. So this has already been done at the container level, the API level. All of the APIs have changed to using Jakarta, but your code that depends upon it needs to change. So if you have an application that you're going to continue to support and run on newer versions of Java, etc., you're going to need to make the um, make the transition to the Jakarta namespace. So your code has to change from JavaX to Jakarta. And yes, you will be affected even if you use Spring. I'll get into that a little bit further in the presentation, but Spring also uses Jakarta EE technologies, and it is impacted as well as Jakarta EE applications. So this is really going to impact most Java developers out there are going to be impacted by this transition. So what changed? The namespace change is the main thing. What has changed in Jakarta EE 9, and that's the only change in that release. There are also some changes to the namespaces. You don't need to make those changes necessarily to run with Jakarta EE 9. Um, that's not necessary. The Java versions have also changed. 9 supports a minimum base level of 8. 9.1 switched to supporting Java 11 as the baseline. That doesn't mean that it only supports Java 11. That just means that the implementations that are claiming to support Jakarta EE 9.1 must run on 11 or greater. So many of the application containers and implementations out there right now already support 17. So it's just the baseline so that, if your organization is still running Java 11, you're fine. That's the baseline that they're supporting. And that's the feature set from the language that they're going to be using. So they won't be adding in any features from, 16, for example. WIT did not change. As I mentioned, there are no new features in this release and there are no functional changes. So the idea is to make it as simple as possible for the application containers to get support for Jakarta EE9 and also for the applications to port over and deal with the fallout without having to worry about dealing with APIs that are removed or feature changes to the platform. So the idea is that it's really simple. You just make the changes to the namespaces and you're off and running and to not have anything else that could muddy the waters. So with this, however, binary compatibility is broken. So this is the first time that we have a release of Java EE Jakarta EE that's not backward compatible. So everything must change. Now with this release, it's been said multiple times that its primary target is tool vendors as they try to get the containers out there. So some of the containers they have released candidates for 9.1, allowing you to test out your changes, but they're not actually going to release a 9.1. They're going to release when 10 comes out with the newer features, right? Because the only change for a server implementing 9.1 is the namespace changes. So some old APIs that have been deprecated are being removed in EE10, Jakarta EE10. So moving to EE9 might be easier if your app is old or kind of using some of the features that are being dropped. So it's a good thing to get ahead of this now to check to see, what impact what impact will this have upon your application, especially on your third-party dependencies. So what happens if you take some code and you um, try to run it in Glassfish 6, which is the EE9 implementation? So when I took a Java Jakarta EE8 application, dropped it into Glassfish 6, the application deployed, but it didn't quite work correctly. So none of my beans were discovered. There was no error message that anything had gone wrong, that it couldn't find the code. It was a really simple application, but the application didn't actually work. I didn't see any big flashing errors that it couldn't deploy. I did deploy the application, but it just didn't. Didn't. None of the beans were loaded. I think the facelets page didn't render correctly. There's nothing. Um, Now, some containers are doing a translation for you. Pyera, I believe, does a translation. So if you deploy a Jakarta EE8 application, an EE9 container, it does a translation and converts it to EE9 namespace for you. A bit out of the box, Glassfish and Tomcat, the application will deploy but not work. There are a number of implementations that are out there now. Um, so pretty much all the major players have implementations of 9.1 out there, either release candidates or fully released like Open Liberty. And there are some new ones that have popped up, some Chinese application containers um, that have joined as well. So the transition is moving along very well. So if you're looking at trying, you know, trying the transition, converting your application over, now is a good time to do it because, as we're, a year and a half ago, there weren't that many implementations. Now there are a lot of implementations, and it's easy to do that. So Tomcat has a release out there on EE9. They even have a release, I believe, out there already coming for EE changes with EE10. Um, And as I mentioned, Spring is also impacted by this. So that will be coming in fourth quarter of 2022. They already have betas uh, candidates out there so that you can try your Spring application on this. So they're switching at the same time they're jumping to Java and to Jakarta EE9 baseline. So and there's a link if you want more information on that. But Spring is impacted as well. So if you're a Spring developer, you will have to deal with this transition as well as Jakarta EE developers. Um, so for the Tomcat, if you're a Tomcat user, just kind of split out the different versions and which ones goes with which. When you go to download it, Jakarta EE8 is the Tomcat 9 release branches. Jakarta EE9 came out with 10.0, and there's a version number after that for each of the individual releases. And then the Jakarta EE10, they're going to keep the same Tomcat 10, but it's going to be 10.1 is going to be the Jakarta EE10 releases. So if you're an Apache Tomcat user, you already have EE9 and 10 releases out there that you can start playing with today and seeing how your application behaves. Open Liberty has different downloads as well right now, so they have both uh, EE9 and Jakarta EE9 and 8 releases that are out there. And their releases also include the micro profile, which was released on Jakarta EE9 about 2 months ago, as well as Pyra is in the same boat. Um, So next major release for these containers, Pyera, Wildfly, and Quarkus will be on Jakarta E10. So they do have release candidates out on 9, but not necessarily on. They haven't released formally for EE9. They just have release candidates out there. But the next major release of the software will be on EE10. But you can try it today. And so I highly recommend starting that transition right now to see the impact. If you're curious as for what an EE9 application looks like, I have created a starter shell that you can clone on GitHub, which is, has the Maven imports, the Maven coordinates and everything, the XML namespaces, everything is set up for Jakarta EE9. So if you're looking to get started. Now, so if you have an existing application and you want to transform it, you've got two choices with the transformation. I mean, actually three if you kind of combine the two of them. So you can make the changes to the source code where you go through your entire application and rename everything from Jakarta to JavaX, or you can use a binary conversion tool. There are two of them, one's provided by Apache, the other one by Eclipse, to iterate over your project and basically make changes to the bytecode to switch the imports. And note, if you are still on Java 8, additional work may be necessary if you're moving to 9.1. So if your application is older, you're still on Jakarta EE7 or EE8, and you haven't made the transition to past Java 8 yet, you may have additional work that's completely unrelated to the Jakarta EE9 transition. So just keep that in mind if you have an application that's slightly older and still running on 8, that you may have additional work to move past 8. Um, And additionally, you also have to update tooling. So this is an error message that I got when I took an existing project and tried to switch it over to running on compiling and building with Jakarta EE 9, I ran into trouble with the Maven plugin, complaining about it. So the first step in a migration, if you're doing a source code migration, is to update your POM file to point at Jakarta EE. In this case right here, I've gone for 9.1, which has a baseline of Java 11 required. If you're still using 8, you can switch to the 9 release and just put 9 in. And going into the IDE, now it's not just a simple find and replace. There are Java X namespaces used by other things in Java that you can't just say, okay, wherever you find Java X, switch it to Jakarta. That won't necessarily work. You'll end up with some cases where you do indeed still need Java X, and you'll have compiler problems. So we're far enough along in the transition now that the tooling is caught up. And so, for example, in the case of IntelliJ, they have a refactoring tool that will migrate your code from Java EE to Jakarta EE. So you click on that, it goes through your entire project, does all of the conversions for you of the imports, and you're off and running. I did this on the cargo tracker application. Literally, I had the application over on EE 9.1 in less than 30 seconds. So it's fairly straightforward to do that. That's the easy part for the transition. Now the hard part is your dependencies, because your dependencies also may use Jakarta EE9 APIs. Um, And so in the cases, so if you're using things like prime faces, Hibernate, DeltaSpike, OmniFaces, all of these are also impacted by the transition as well, which means that you'll need to move to the most recent releases of these to get onto Jakarta EE9. Um, and this can be a little bit tricky. And you might also, depending upon what else you're using, you might have some transitive dependency that is still that's using EE8 APIs and namespace. So for the migration, so for example, for prime faces, um, their version 11 comes in two flavors. One is for Jakarta EE8, and the other one is for Jakarta EE9X. And they use a classifier in the dependency to specify whether you're going with the older one or the newer one. So if you want to go with Jakarta EE9, you're going to put in the classifier being Jakarta. And so that's the approach that they've taken. Um, Hibernate has taken a little bit different approach. Um, they've switched from Hibernate Core to Hibernate Core Jakarta. So this is where the transition I think really gets tricky, is that you're going to have to go through your POM files or your great old make files and figure out, what for each dependency, whether it's a dependency that's using a Jakarta EE technology, and then what is the Jakarta EE9 implementation of it. And there doesn't appear to be a consistent approach to how to identify what is a Jakarta EE9 versus Jakarta EE8 and before um, implementation. In the case of DeltaSpike, there's not an implementation yet available, so you'd have to use the Eclipse Transformer that I'm going to cover in a little bit to build a jar file, take their existing Jakarta EE8 and build a jar file with Jakarta EE9 so that you can at least get past that, and then check that into your local Maven repository and use it. For OmniFaces, they're doing it based upon versions. So if you're on 3.1, 3.3x code line is Jakarta EE8. The 4 release, um, the 4.0 release is for Jakarta EE9. So that's, we've now seen, I think, 3 or 4 different approaches for how to deal with dependencies. And that's what makes this kind of tricky as you're looking at your application, because you're going to have to go through your dependencies and figure out, okay, what is the equivalent? Is it available on Jakarta EE9? And then, what are the coordinates for it? And depending upon how old your application is, the last time you updated dependencies, there might be some additional transition that you have to go in. So if you're still on prime faces 5 and you have to move to the most recent version for Jakarta EE9, they have code changes in there. Um, so you might have to deal with migrating different versions of some of the frameworks that you're using in addition to it. So the actual transition, I don't think will be, you know, changing your code to move over to Jakarta EE9. I don't think is the biggest issue. The biggest issue is dealing with dependencies, and if you're not up to date on your dependencies, having to move to newer versions of your dependencies in order to run on the newer containers. And then, the Archillian for testing, you have to update that as well. And also if you're using Archillian for testing, the container plugins that you're using, for example, the embedded container, those have to change as well. And not all of those are available at last check. And then finally, if you are using MicroProfile, currently Pyra 6 and OpenLiberty both support MicroProfile 5, which is on top of Jakarta, the Jakarta EE9 release. Okay. And so that's the code transformation. So if you're doing the code transformation, you're going to use your IDE to quickly go through and change all of your imports. You're then going to go through all of your Maven dependencies and upgrade those to work with Jakarta to the Jakarta EE9 release, and deal with the fact that there's no unified way to identify which dependency is for which version of Jakarta. And that's a big bang type thing. So it's kind of like, you have to make all those changes in order to get your code to compile so that you can deploy and test it. So it's kind of one of those things that, it might take a while to work through to make all the changes just to get your code to a point where it compiles successfully and then deploys. And then the other approach that you can take, and you can take this approach first, actually, what's called the code transformations. And these two tools work on the bytecode to make changes to the bytecode to change the imports. So the first one is the Eclipse Transformer, and the other one is the Tomcat Transformer. Um, so the Eclipse Transformer is a file from Java EE8 to Jakarta EE9. It updates the imports and updates any of the included jar files within the war file. So if you have prime faces, it'll go through the prime faces jar and also make changes to it as well. That doesn't mean that if it's a really old version of a dependency that's got some incompatibility with more recent things, doesn't mean it'll work correctly. It'll just mean that it changed the imports. You download it from the Eclipse uh, project website. I found it a little tricky in order to get to it because I had to go. You click on the link, it takes you to Maven Central, essentially. Then I had to drill down and get the distribution jar, the Org Eclipse transformer, then unzip it and run it. So in order to run it, you do java-jar, the transformer jar, and the war file that you want to transform. Run it on the war file. It prints out a bunch of things. It's got a bunch of configuration parameters that you can adjust for specific edge cases. Does the transformation, spits out a new war file that you can then take and deploy into a Jakarta EE9 container. This for doing it to the cargo tracker example application took all of 10 seconds, and then I deployed the application and it ran. So that tool is fairly easy. I believe there's a Maven plugin for it, although I haven't found it yet. That also, if you don't want to use the command line, that will do it from the um, as a part of your Maven build process. There's also the Jakarta EE migration tool from Tomcat, which is up on the Tomcat website, which you can also use. I haven't used this one. I've primarily been using the one from Eclipse. And And in this case right here, so this is a case where I went through and wait a minute. So this is okay. So this going back, so that's the transformer. Now, if you going back to the code approach, if you went through your code and didn't get all of your um, dependencies updated correctly, if you didn't do the code transformation approach and you did the code approach, um, and you missed a dependency, you might see a weird error message like this where it can't access. You'll see the container goes to deploy code and say, this code can't access Java X faces event faces event, and notice the Java X at the beginning. That means that the third-party dependency that your application is depending upon is attempting to use something from the Java X namespace when it's not available. So that's the type of error that you'll come across. And in the case of looking at the code, the code for Cargo Tracker looked perfectly fine. We had flow event right here, and this was coming from the correct package. It was because it itself depended upon a Jakarta EE8 feature, namespace. So if we looked at um, the code for flow event, you'll see that when the IDE decompiled it, it was using JavaX. So that's the transition to um, Jakarta EE9 in a nutshell. So you've got two approaches for doing that. You can either, if you're not going to be supporting an application going forward, and you're just trying to get it to run and see what the impact will be, you can use the Eclipse Transformer to do the transformation. The code transformation is if the application is going to continue to evolve. That is where you'd want to go into the IDE, update your Maven dependencies, and get it up and running, correctly. Fully with your code base on Jakarta EE9. Now, the reason to move Jakarta EE9 is that there's a lot more exciting features that are coming after EE9. So the work for Jakarta EE10 is well underway, and it's going to be released, I think, either in this quarter or next quarter. Um, so there's a bunch of exciting new features on that. There's a new profile. So Quarkus and Helidon will now be Jakarta EE compatible. So there's a profile for that. Um, so there's a lot of exciting changes coming. So Jakarta Batch is adding support for CDI integration. Um, Authorization is adding support for policy providers. There's cleanup going on in expression language. Jakarta JSON binding is adding new features for supporting polymorphic types and also handling null support. Jakarta E10, we have the RESTful Web Services version 4. So there's changes coming for CDI scopes for all Jakarta E REST types. There's enhancing the discovery of application artifacts using CDI scanning. So there's coming in Jakarta E10. So that's why you want to get the transition. Jakarta E9 is just the namespace change. Jakarta E10 is introducing new features. So for example, on Jakarta EE10 with Jakarta Security, there's going to be additional authentication mechanisms for OpenID and OAuth, extended authentication support for doing authentication per URL, user choice of authentication mechanism. It's adding in finally a CDI equivalent for CDI for the roles allowed, which comes from the EJB specification, authorization modules. Um, Faces is removing some older features. It's rebasing itself on CDI. It's adding features for extensionless views, client window scope, and allowing redirect via annotation on action. And there's also some minor API enhancements as well. Concurrency is getting a major update, first time in a long time, to basically catch up with what's been going on the platform in the Java util concurrent package. So it's adding support for the fork join pool. There's also a new asynchronous annotation that's been added to standardize that. Jakarta EE10, big new feature here is the CDI Lite with a new meta model underneath it, which reduces the need for reflection. So this enables CDI to be used outside of the container easily in smaller applications. Also, I believe in smaller like little services that you could implement. And the reduction in reflection should make it to be easier to use for things like RAL VM if you're compiling your code. Down to native code, some API cleanup and some quality of life improvements. So startup and shutdown events for the container, and some programmatic lookup enhancements if you use those. So for the transition to Jakarta E9, that was kind of a quick snapshot of what's coming in Jakarta EE10. More information on that, of course, will be forthcoming. But that's the real reason you want to get moving right now is you want to get over this hump. You want to get onto um, Jakarta EE9 so that you can then start taking advantage of the new features that are coming in Jakarta EE10. And so, the transition, if you're continuing to port your application forward, get your Maven plugins, except Maven Gradle plugins updated to the most recent. Get your third-party dependencies updated. So if your application right now and you're still on EE8, um, you want to start tackling this right now to make sure that you're on the latest. If you're using Prime Faces, that you're on the most recent version of Prime Faces, so that you're not trying to deal with multiple transitions at the same time. This transition, if you're using a library from 5 or 6 years ago, they've made some significant API changes. That might be more of an impact than the actual Jakarta EE9 transition. So you really want to also to keep an eye on deprecation warnings because things are now being actually removed. Things that are deprecated are actually being removed from the platform. and then use the IDE migration tool to update the imports, is very quick. And then if you have an application that's in maintenance, use the Eclipse Transformer to migrate the code base. This is easy. It's not, not a big deal. It depends upon, code debt. If you're still on Java 8 and you haven't made the jump to Java 11 or behind, you're probably going to have more work to move forward. If you're behind on dependencies and you're using libraries that have added Jakarta EE9 support, but 2 versions ago they made a major change to the API that's going to affect your application. That's going to be more of an impact than the actual Jakarta transition. So, a reference application to take a look at is the cargo tracker. This one, I've got an implementation of it running. I've ported it to Jakarta EE9. It's not that hard to do. This is a good exercise if you want to try an application, check out the EE8 version of it, which is what's up there right now, and do the transformation to Jakarta EE9. That will give you a good idea of what's involved. So you can see the type of errors that you're going to run into, because you can take a look at my repository and see, okay, this is, this is what it was, this is what it has to go with, and that gives you some idea for your application, what's going to be involved in doing the transition. Some just some resources. Definitely get involved. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm president of the Jakarta EE ambassadors. So we're trying to, get the information out there as to what's going on with this. So please feel free to check us out, and also get involved with Jakarta EE. It's sometimes actually work on these standards and in the implementations, given that millions of developers depend upon it. So it's really critical that, you know, people get involved and continue pushing it forward, because just don't assume somebody else will get involved and jump in. Mailing lists, and Jakarta has really good tech talks on a regular basis. So I encourage you to check those out, that go over a number of different topics, including transitions, too. So there's presentations by individual vendors, I believe, in terms of making the transition to Jakarta EE9. So I encourage you to check those out. And so that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?